Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to join us for our second BC Hotel Association webinar. I'm very pleased and proud to have Krista and Arun from GoToHR with us today. So this webinar is really a joint partnership to support you as our industry, having the opportunity to have a week or so to digest what this best practice document and guideline is all about, and then providing you an opportunity to ask questions and answers. I'd like to open by letting you know that this webinar will be available for those people that have been unable to join us today. And it is being recorded. We will send that out on our in our communique, which will be going out tomorrow morning. And feel free to share that with your counterparts in your communities or around the province. I'd also like to just acknowledge that we have had a new directive after, as of yesterday afternoon, from our Premier with the extension of the state of emergency. That actually does in fact impact us, and we can talk about that during the webinar today. What that really means is that phase 3 looks like it might be mid-June at the earliest. And you know, the first question is, how does that affect us? Well, currently, our industry as an accommodation industry of all different types and styles is actually deemed an essential service, which means we are currently fully eligible to be open and to be operating for a multitude of reasons. And many of you have in fact been open all along and been providing support services for your communities and the province as requested and as needed. And I'd like to take a moment to thank you very much for stepping up and providing the safe shelter that you've done. Now, it's very important that we understand the state of emergency and the current travel advisories from the Premier and our Minister of Health doesn't mean that travel is forbidden. People have been staying in accommodation around the province all along, and campgrounds, as we know, are all open as of June 1st. There is slightly different regulation or slightly different advisories around our BC parks versus the private independent. And our partners at BCLCA, that's BC Lodging and Campground, if any of you are looking for the protocols around camping and lodges within their association, you can go to their website for that information, but they in fact are open and operating. Thank you very much, Terry, for once again being our brilliant person behind the scenes. So I'll now ask you to please go to the next slide. As an introduction, I'm Ingrid Jarrett, President and CEO of the BC Hotel Association. Proudly assumed this role in February of this year. It's been a whirlwind few months, as I'm sure you can all imagine. You know, our goal is that we provide for you, our industry, as much support and information as we possibly can to make sure that you are provided the communication, the direction, and the support mechanisms to be able to survive during this pandemic. We've been working very hard federally with my other provinces and counterparts, as well as provincially and municipally, ensuring that your voices are heard, that there are relief measures that are provided to you to ensure that as an industry, we're able to sustain ourselves, get through this dreadful time, and that we can look back on it and think, thank goodness that's in the past. Here's 2 photos of me. I love to fish. That's Okanagan Lake at about 4:30 in the morning for a BC Business article. It just shows I'm a little bit more of a person than the voice that you always hear. So thank you very much for being here again today. Next slide, please, Terry. Krista, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ingrid, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Krista Bax, and I'm the CEO at GoToHR. I'm very pleased to be with you here today to talk about this very important topic. For those of you that don't know, GoToHR is the HR association for BC's tourism and hospitality industry, and we've been around in some form of another since 1973. In partnership with WorkSafeBC, we're also the Health and Safety Association for BC tourism and hospitality industries. So underneath this dual mandate, we do a number of things. We support employers with their HR needs, such as recruitment, retention, and understanding the labor market. We provide industry training, such as our popular Superhost training program, the customer service training program, and Food Safe. We lead industry career awareness initiatives and offer tools to job seekers and employers, such as our job board. And finally, the reason why we're here today is we work with employers to ensure the health and safety of their businesses and their operations. So since COVID has decided to appear, we've been working with a number of sectors in developing their COVID operating best practices, and we've been working very closely with Ingrid and her team on the best practice document that you see here today and that we'll be discussing. And so with that, I'll pass that over to Arun, who is our Director of Industry Health and Safety at GoToHR.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you, Ingrid, for giving us the opportunity to present today. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Arun Subramanian. I lead the Health and Safety Program practice at GoToHR. As Krista mentioned, we are the Health and Safety Association for Tourism and Hospitality, but we are also the certifying partner for the core program. And I know there are a lot of hotels in BC are core certified, and I want to give a shout out to all the core employers who are on this call today. I will be speaking to you later in the webinar about creating your safety plans. So in the meantime, I give this back to Ingrid to move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. You know, over the last, after the, I suppose it's more than 2 months now, we have had working groups. As soon as we understood that we needed a slightly revised way of doing business when we were in our recovery mode. And it was very evident that within the accommodation industry, we have many different subsectors and all different configurations. So the best practice document that was developed was done so by many of you that are on the call today participating. And we really looked at all the different subsectors of the industry. Krista and I have been sort of completely aligned with Arun, and they provided significant support and expertise in compiling all the working documents that were submitted to myself. And then that was all compiled. And the key here was that it needed to be scalable. It needed to be workable for an operation. It needed to be make sure that we kept the health and safety of our employees, our employers, the business at hand, and our guests in mind, that we were aligned with best practices from other jurisdictions and our overarching best practice from the Hotel Association of Canada, and that also that the WorkSafeBC guidelines by which we are all guided by in our workplace, that was also recognized and integrated into the document. Last Wednesday, our document on behalf of the industry was submitted to government and to WorkSafeBC. At the end of day yesterday, I did receive feedback, and I'm pleased to say that they were very, very complimentary, and they were really supportive on the amount of work and the detail and the common sense approach of the document. We have made one revision, and that revision was to include at the beginning of the document the background on how you as an operator, as a hotelier or running an inn or a condo hotel, can develop your safety plan to ensure that you've used the best practices identified by WorkSafeBC. And literally that is the only update. Other than we also realized that we had neglected to include the BC lodging and campground best practices. So that is now also included. So within the document is every subsector under the accommodation umbrella. We will be reissuing that along with this webinar tomorrow in your communique so that you can use that as the tool that it was meant to be. So without further ado, we can go into the next slide. We thought it relevant for the webinar today to detail a couple of those changes from an operating excellence perspective that are detailed in the best practices. Please note the best practices are a guideline for you. As an owner-operator or as a hotelier or a management company, it is your need to manage your business well. These are guidelines and best practices that you need to determine what is workable for you, whether you want to go above and beyond and include things that are not included in this document, or whether or not you need to be looking at it and saying, is that reasonable because of the configuration of my property? So some of the common questions that we've been getting in the details is that currently, while we are in the pandemic, it is recommended that there will be no housekeeping services during a guest stay. It would be very advisable that your guest will know this ahead of arrival, because in fact, that is a kind of a standard that in British Columbia, we do turn down service, we do stayover service, we replace towels and linens and things like that. So currently there's details in the document that actually show you operationally what the best practice would determine that you would do. Another key piece is after the guest stay, it's recommended that there is a 3-hour time frame between departure and arrival. This means you may need to look at your housekeeping schedules and your teams, or whether or not they work independently, and actually look at that. And that supports not only the entire air exchange in the suite itself, but also it ensures that your housekeeping team understands the importance of that time space. Now, of course, we all know as information daily comes, many things change. So currently it is noted that this is a best practice that is being recommended in the document. Terry, next slide, please. Physical distancing. You know, we know this with our friends and our communities, our families, and now our workplaces. So this physical distancing really means when you're developing your safety plan, you'll be looking at everything from arrival to departure and everything in between. Where in the spaces within your organization can you have one way in and another way out? Where can you, for example, in the lobby, reconfigure the seating so that you will have those family pods or groups that come together and not have mixing groups? Where will you be able to provide sort of social distancing, this 6 feet apart, so that people can be guided by whether it's stickers or signs or that kind of thing, and making sure that you're educating and reinforcing this physical distancing. The same would be for check-in and check-out, and that would be touchless, which I think we're becoming more and more familiar with the tap machines and actually self-check-in, or even some of the apps that work hand in hand with our lock systems. Next slide, please, Terry. Pools, spas, and beaches. We're getting a lot of questions around this. There is very limited information, especially about pools on the BC CDC website. It does cite the physical distancing of 6 feet should be maintained on the pool deck. We are doing quite a bit of research on this, and we have recently added the best practices for spas, because spas are once again reopening. Beaches, it is all about physical distancing. And any of you in Vancouver or in the Okanagan will be able to see those long expanses of beaches where we love to gather when the sun is out with our families. And it doesn't mean that many people can't be in a large space when you're outside, but it does mean that you need to ensure that you're distanced from other groups of people or other people, period, if you're there as an individual. The pool guidelines right now have not been issued. We are securing best practices in pools. And so as soon as we do that, we'll certainly update you. So physical distancing, crowd control, making sure as an operator that you have somebody watching for those and guiding your guests accordingly. And then of course, those any touch points. So wherever people are touching, you need to make sure that you have a heightened cleaning program. Next slide, please, Terry. And check-in and check-out. I referenced this earlier. Briefly, pre-arrival communications is very important. So having on your website what your commitment is to the heightened sense of cleaning, not only will that support your brand, but also educate your guest, because some guests may be much more aware of what some of these different protocols are than others. Physical distancing, ensuring that you're communicating and that you're educating the guests and and also your teams to what that physical distancing looks like and how they can manage that. Crowd flow, I think, will be a big opportunity for us to be looking at the flow of people coming and going. And then again, contactless check-in. And then we all think about the elevators. And again, that means heightened cleaning protocols, tracking it, making sure that people understand when you have many people coming and going, that means you need to do it much more often than when there are very few people in the building. Next slide, please, Terry. Arun, please. Oh, you need to take yourself off mute. Or maybe I can.
Okay, got it.
Thank you. There you are.
Okay, thank you, Ingrid. Just picking up where Ingrid left off, the occupational health and safety regulations, as Ingrid mentioned, require employers in British Columbia to take reasonable precautions to ensure the health and safety of their employees. As hoteliers look at restarting their business, WorkSafeBC and the provincial health officer have asked businesses to develop a safety plan to ensure the safety of both their employees as well as their customers. So how do we really build a safety plan? Ideally, a safety plan should be a part of your larger restart plan, which would probably include things like the starting date, as Ingrid mentioned. There's some confusion around that. So when do you actually plan to start operations in your property if you're closed? What is it that you require to restart? When do you call your employees back to work? Who are you calling? How many are you calling? When are you calling them? So all these elements form part of the restart plan, but probably the biggest piece would be the safety plan, considering the environment that we are operating in. So a starting point for that may be to actually look at appointing someone on your team to be a lead for this whole plan. So someone who can not only help in creating the safety plan, but also in terms of its implementation once the plan is in place. The next slide, please. So the start, as far as any safety planning goes, is in assessing the risks. So the risk assessment forms the basis of creating any safety plan. So under the current circumstances, I think some of the elements that Ingrid already outlined were revolving around the proximity and the contaminated surfaces. So COVID-19, which you probably all heard multiple times by now, typically spreads through the air when there's close proximity, but mostly through contact through contaminated surfaces. So when you're doing a risk assessment of your hotel, you'll probably have to identify those areas where there's a challenge in maintaining physical distancing. So these could be some of your frontline areas such as the lobby or the elevators, but it could also be your back of the house areas like your kitchens or your breakout or your break rooms that your staff use. The other piece is the contact piece. So typically in high traffic areas, especially, where are the points that people come in contact with, both your own employees as well as your customers? What are those points that there's maximum contact, and how are you going to address that? The third element is, anything that people, especially your employees, may be sharing. So these could be, simple things like pens may be used in a reception. If you have multiple people working in your reception area, sharing pens and other pieces of stationery could also be a challenge. And finally, if you have keys, if you're still using keys and you're handing keys over to your customers, that's often something there's a high level of contact. When you're doing this whole risk assessment, it's really critical that you involve your frontline employees. So your employees not only have the understanding of their workspace, probably a little more than what you might. They also interact with a lot of the customers, and they're familiar with not only the workplace but also the way they actually do the work. So they'll be probably able to highlight some of the areas of risk. If you have a health and safety committee, please involve them, or a health and safety rep, anybody from the frontline supervisors who can help you assess risk better. The next slide, please. So once you've understood what the risk is, obviously you're trying to find a way to eliminate or reduce that risk. When we talk about risk mitigation, typically we speak about controls that we can put in place to mitigate risk. So there is what is known as a hierarchy of controls, which is essentially a step-by-step approach to evaluating what is the best way of mitigating the risk that you identified in your previous step. I won't go into too much detail on this because I think the slide self-explanatory, but the key mitigation effort is always the elimination piece, because if you can keep the risk out of the workplace, that's probably the safest way to approach it. For instance, you may have parts of your hotel that you may choose not to operate or not to open up during this phase. I mean, these could be business centers, or these could be maybe a coach that you usually operate. And you then go down through these levels where you cannot eliminate, go through these different levels of the hierarchy that you identified, and then choose the one that works best for you. I would though like to speak about the personal protective equipment, which is the fourth level. Unfortunately, a lot of times I hear from employers and even around us actually, in terms of using PPEs to mitigate any risk associated with COVID. So when we talk about risk mitigation, the talk almost immediately shifts to personal protective equipment. And there is a challenge in this approach. Personal protective equipments, as you can see from that hierarchy, are the least effective in terms of mitigating the risk. So when you consider personal protective equipment, it's important that you keep a few things in mind. One, that you've considered the three other elements that are identified above it before actually looking at personal protective equipment. Second, that your staff who are going to be using it understand the right usage and how they should actually put them on and take them off, especially gloves and masks. Improper usage actually increases the risk both for your employees as well as your customers. So this is something that's really critical. Another very practical consideration here is availability. I mean, there is such a huge need for these in the market that employers increasingly have a challenge in obtaining these supplies. So to plan that out in case you need personal protective equipment, to factor that into your restart plans. And finally, just the sheer cost. You know, there is such a high cost associated with this because most of these are disposable, single-use, masks and gloves. So then you need to keep using them. You need to not only have a short supply, but also you need to, spend the money on getting those in place. So once again, so please do consider the three levels of, these control measures before you actually land on the PPE when none of those can possibly work. The next slide. So once you've identified the risks and you've identified some of the control measures that can address that risk, the question is, what do you need to actually implement them or operationalize them? So policies or developing policies and guidelines around anything around COVID-19 and the new procedures that you're putting in place are the critical next step. So what would these typically contain? For instance, any of your guidelines may talk about what employees can expect when they come back to work. What is it that they need to do when they're sick, for instance? Who do they go to or how do they report? What are some of those symptoms that typically need to be watched out for in your employees? So all these are things that should be documented so there's some clarity for everybody concerned about what they're looking out for. I won't get into all the policies here, but one that I would definitely like to speak to is the sick leave policy. And you probably realize the amount of importance this has gained in the last week or so with the Prime Minister weighing in on a national, sick leave policy for all employees. So this is fairly critical for a couple of reasons. One is that, yes, there's, the governments are looking at finding ways to ensure that everybody gets paid sick leave. But it's also because you're telling your employees to stay away from the workplace if they're sick. Now, if that is the case, what exactly does that mean? Are they going to get paid, not get paid? Who are they supposed to contact when they're sick? Who's supposed to tell them whether they can come back into work or not? So these protocols, making sure that these are visible to everybody concerned is, I think, an important factor. The next slide, please. Finally, when you have addressed all these elements, how do you ensure that everybody is on the same page? If you're opening or reopening, most likely your employees have been out of work for a few months. So they are coming back to a workplace that is, on the one hand, very familiar to them, but on the other hand, is full of new protocol and procedures which they have never used before. So there is not only a sense of anxiety in terms of exposure and sickness, but there's also anxiety in terms of what they should do to comply and what they're really responsible for. So a robust orientation or an onboarding program when they come back in, that gives them all this information around all the procedures that you put in place, not only to ensure their safety, but also your customer safety, is very critical. It's also important that you communicate continuously to employees as you start reopening and continue through the reopening phase and your regular operations phase, because you can bet that things may not always play out the way you've envisaged and you may need to make changes. So helping employees understand where they are and what they need to change based on some of the changing circumstances is also critical. We also highlighted the point of contact, a person who could be a lead person in this. So making sure that everybody is aware of who this person is and their availability in terms of answering questions that employees may have, but also maybe, where employees can go to if customers have questions about some of your policies. So this gives them the comfort that there is a single point of contact that they can approach with anything that they find they're unsure of. And policies, we already spoke to the documentation around these, making sure that these policies are written, making sure other documentation, maybe training records, etc., are actually there, which can be verified if required, is also very critical under the circumstance. You're putting in a lot of work to put these practices into place. It's important that there's evidence of that work. And finally, reminding employees about what they need to do. Simple things like physical distancing, which we have typically not done. We probably had never heard of this term, a few months back. So this is something that's new in everybody's vocabulary, and it doesn't necessarily make us all comfortable with, even after a couple of months of living with it. So constant reminders would definitely help. And finally, you need to communicate all this good work to your customers. You're putting in a lot of effort, lot of time, lot of resources into ensuring their safety when they come back to your business, or enticing them to come back to your business because you're providing that level of safety. So it's critical that you communicate this in a way that best suits your business needs and addresses some of the concerns that they may probably have. But there's also one other element here. The public health order that was released recently requires employers to post this information on their websites about what they're doing to actually protect their customers and their employees under the circumstances. So you may or may not want to present the entire safety plan, but you need to give them some level of highlight in terms of what you're doing to ensure their safety. The next slide, please. Leading into what I spoke about in the earlier slide is effective supervision. As we all know, in a regular operational workplace, it's essential that there is adequate supervision. That applies to the current scenario too. As I mentioned, there's a lot of new procedures, guidelines that will be implemented, ensuring that employees understand what is required of them and are doing the things that they've been tasked with and the way they've been asked to is essential. It's also important to support employees in this time when they're looking at new procedures which they're not used to before. And record keeping, again, I mentioned in the previous slide, is of critical importance, not only from ensuring that your employees know where to get information from, but also from a inspection perspective, which I'll speak to in the next slide. So WorkSafeBC, as you know, is tasked with inspecting workplaces and ensuring that the workplaces are safe. So they're going to be visiting employer premises. At the start, from what I hear, they're looking at actually helping and supporting employers putting these safety plans in place. So it's not so much in terms of issuing orders or finding fault, as much as being a support for employers to help them navigate through some of these new requirements that have been put in place. So when they do come to your workplace, one of the things that always applies to WorkSafeBC inspectors is, or the prevention officers, is they are allowed unimpeded access of your workplace by law. So yes, you may have protocol for them to enter, but they should be able to enter any area of your workplace if it's a reasonable request. Now, having said that, what is it that they would typically look for? So under the circumstances, our understanding is they probably would first look for the safety plan itself. So do you have a safety plan? And if you do, does it actually take into account some of the guidelines that have been identified as far as WorkSafeBC and provincial health orders as to what it should contain. Apart from the plan, how are you actually putting this into practice? Practically speaking, has this been operationalized in a way that it should be? Finally, a look at what your employees think of this. I mean, do they understand what the requirements are? Have they been trained on it? Do they know who to go to if there's an issue? All these things would be things that they would look at. And finally, considering the current circumstances and COVID-19 and its specialities, so to speak, the focus on hygiene will be big. So anything on hygiene etiquette, physical distancing, contact, if PPE is being used, whether the right PPE is used, also, your washrooms, the cleanliness, the cleaning schedules, if there's enough hand sanitizer around and things of that nature. Finally, as you look at building your plans, WorkSafeBC has a safety plan template on their website, and we've included that as part of our resources at the end. So that probably would be a good tool to help you, actually implement or create a plan for yourself. We also have specific sector-specific guidelines that Ingrid has spoken about that you've all received, and you'll receive an updated version tomorrow. And we also have a lot of resources on our website that can help you with this. Apart from that, it's also, we are always available to talk about this. We have safety specialists at GoTo who can support you with this. So please feel free to reach out for us, and also be aware that this information is constantly changing. So please keep looking at our websites to see what is new and how we can support you. I'll be happy to take questions. Back to you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Arun. So thank you to everybody that sent questions ahead of time. We've just got a couple here that were the most common or most asked that we thought we would address right up front. Number one question, what date can we open our business? Your businesses are eligible to be open right now if you are in the accommodation sector. You were never deemed to be closed. As I referenced earlier, you've been deemed an essential service. You have the full right to open. And if and when you're either reopening or opening under these new, this new reality, obviously we highly recommend that you use the tools provided in our best practices. Next slide, please. Why are we both an essential service that is open and operating according to the CDC guidelines, and also not open until phase 3? Very, very confusing terminology coming from many different places. And it is very difficult for us to influence those messages. But I can tell you, you currently, because you're an essential service and because the non-essential travel is an advisory, we do know people are making reservations and people are staying in hotels and at different accommodators. And they are doing that for a multiple, all kinds of different reasons. So the most important thing as somebody who is operating during this state of emergency as an accommodator is that you are confident that you are able to provide the health and safety best practices that you can protect yourselves, your staff, and your guests under the new operating procedures that are being recommended for your consideration. I hope that it's very difficult because there's new messaging coming all the time. But at this time, there is an advisory for non-essential and to only travel within short distances from where you live and work. And then we are anticipating the next phase will be complete support for traveling within British Columbia. But that non-essential travel advisory has not been issued yet. And we're thinking that's coming with phase 3. Many, many hotels are opening this week because they were anticipating the beginning of June to be the beginning of phase 3. That means that those safety plans, that training, the cleaning of your hotel, the spacing and physical distancing, and all of those kind of things are part of your reopening. And if you, as an operator, want to be open and ready for business, when it comes your way, and we don't know if that's going to be as part of the essential service network or beyond that. That is completely fine. Next slide, please. When do you expect to see formal guidelines, protocols from the government surrounding smaller business meetings, training seminars, and/or social events? Okay, so currently within the best practice guidelines, we did include meetings protocols, and we did that purposefully because the mandate or the message from our Minister of Health has been around meetings and group gatherings and events under 50 people. Well, currently we have accommodators all over the province of different sizes that are completely prepared to practice with best practice protocols so that those meetings can continue. The next phase will be that we will be working on larger meetings and different configurations. But at this point, the protocols are scalable, but they are completely geared to smaller business meetings. Social events, again, that has been something like weddings. Many weddings have been canceled this year, regrettably. That is not something that has yet to be sanctioned by the government. And many, because of the social, the physical distancing, it's very difficult to have a dance and have social distancing when people are partying. So certainly that is part of the future, not part of what is occurring right now before phase 3. Next slide, please. Okay, we now have an open forum. You have a chat function at the bottom of your screen there. And what I'd like you to do is put your questions into the chat function. I can read your questions as you submit them. And it'll either be myself, Krista, or Arun that will answer the questions that you submit. So please feel free to send us your questions and we'll do the best that we can to answer them. In the event that we don't get to all of your questions, which in fact was the situation on our last webinar, we will ensure that those questions will be answered in our communiques. Okay, what would be best practices for a guest room shower curtain? Remove after departure. Okay, that's a great question, Brady. Currently within the protocols, it does not determine that you have to remove the shower curtain. Again, I believe that the cleaning component that you're using, whether that it is stipulated within the guidelines. So what is that mix for the cleaner? And I believe that you're, depending on what the fabric, if it's a fabric or plastic or, you know, what that is for the shower curtain, I think it can be cleaned. Krista and Arun, I don't know if you have a recommendation there. I mean, it doesn't make sense operationally to me, who I'm a hotelier by trade, to have to remove every shower curtain after every departure. I will say this is the first time I've had this question, so we will commit to going back and making sure that we respond within our communique to confirm that. Should we designate specific common area furniture to individual rooms? I believe that question is, do you have certain areas where each room can gather? And I think that the answer to that would be, depending on your configuration, if you can do something like that, then that would make a lot of sense. But if you have a 100-room hotel and you have a lobby and then a couple of other gathering rooms, that common space, that might not make sense. So I think the common area, again, is as people are traveling in groups, what you want to be doing is keeping that group together and making sure that you're cleaning as people come and go any of those touch points. From Dawn, can we get access to the PowerPoint? And if you're referring to this slide deck, absolutely. It'll be in the communique tomorrow. That'll be distributed along with the recording. If a guest coughs in the lobby and or restaurant, do we address it, or what would be the best course of action? First of all, I think coughing protocol is one that would be very well advised to include in your safety guidelines and your training for your team. And anybody that is coughing without coughing, for example, into their elbow, I would suggest that they would be corrected. And if somebody, in fact, is coughing in a public space, you're perfectly, I would feel very comfortable asking for them to remove themselves and go outside. You know, we never know if it's because they forgot to have a drink of water before they talked for an hour or whether or not they're in fact sick, but we need to take that seriously, especially because we know that it can be airborne through droplets.
Ingrid, if I could just add, that's one thing that that we're looking at, and that's that how do you, you know, correctly and politely, but firmly and when needed, enforce compliance, because you are responsible for you know, behaviors on your work site to keep everyone safe, to keep workers safe, and to keep guests safe. And so it does require a different approach. It's a different environment, it's a different scenario, and there's different sensitivities, and everyone has a different confidence level at the same time. So that's one thing that, you know, as a follow-up in a couple of weeks, we're developing a seminar that'll specifically look at customer service and guest communication and interaction during this COVID environment. And so it'll help address some of those sensitive and challenging situations, and give some guidance and tactics that employers can use in their employee training as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Krista. That's really helpful. I have a couple more questions here. One is, does a housekeeper enter a guest room during the guest stay? And in fact, no. The protocol right now is that there's no turn down service, there's no refresh. A guest has to request any change of linen, and if that happens, you actually, the housekeeper doesn't have to go in the room, you leave it outside. The guests can change their own linen, they can put it in a plastic bag that you provide, leave it outside the door. And that would be the same for garbage pickup. And you can make sure that you have extra garbage bags in order to facilitate that. Is it reasonable to store instead of wash unused linen? What is the storage time for fabric? That is a great question. I'm not sure what you mean by unused linen. If you have a suite that has a 2-bedroom suite and they only used 1 bed, are you asking whether or not you need to change both beds because somebody's been in there or not? I'm not quite sure of this, but I think the time on fabric is part of what we still need to understand with this virus. I would suggest, I'm going to put that, I'm going to find out that answer. I don't know the answer. Krista, can you help with that at all? No. Okay. We'll commit to finding the answer to that.
Sorry, the only thing that I've read about this, Ingrid, at this point, the guidelines seem to suggest that they should wash everything, that's even if it's not used. And that's something that you can reevaluate as you go along.
Yeah, yeah. And every day we get new information. So that's part of why we continue to send you the information that we garner, that we deem is, you know, important. We live in the east side of the province. Less than 2% of our guests travel in province in our area. How are you addressing the influx of Alberta travelers to our area? Are we able to provide accommodation to them without facing problems with the directives on BC only travel? This is a great question. You know, I think I addressed it at the beginning of the webinar, and far be it for me to give any different direction than Dr. Bonnie Henry or the Premier of our province. They are issuing advisories, and their advisory is to stay close to home, within your region or within your community, They're saying this weekend, go out and enjoy, you know, the place in which you live. And starting June 1st, go out and enjoy camping, you know, around the province of BC. The border between Alberta and BC has never been closed. The issue is essential. They are sanctioning essential service. Non-essential service, they're advising to not start until phase 3. Currently, I know that many hotels are, and campgrounds and RV parks and cabins and lodges are accepting reservations. Many people do have guests staying from Alberta currently. I think the east of our province, the east side of our province, it is really now, the conversation is going to the municipality. And this was referenced yesterday and again this morning in an announcement. One of the most important things as industry that we do is connect with our community, our mayor and council, and determine what is our capacity to welcome. At the same time that you are developing your safety plans and you're training your teams and, you know, doing all this work as your best practices and your commitment to your livelihood, it also means that you need to be aware as an accommodator how welcome and how ready is your community to you know, re-welcome the tourism economy back to your place in the province. We have some communities that are absolutely welcoming people now and encouraging people to make their plans. And then we have other communities that potentially may be smaller with lack of a capacity to support should there be a need or if there is some kind of a health crisis. So I do think we all have a role to play here. One of the most important things we need to do if we're going to survive and save our summer is to actually start garnering an increase in consumer confidence. How do we do that? That's sort of the stepping stone. You have to be confident as an operator that you can operate well with great best practices and everybody's health and wellness in mind. Then your community needs to be able to say, you know, this is important and we really love our traveling guests and we're ready for them and we want them to come back. And when those things start happening, my belief is, or my sense, then we're going to see our provincial government much more confident that our industry and the province as a whole is ready to start opening up and welcoming tourists. We don't have the capacity to stop Albertans because the border's never been closed. It's a domestic product. Yet, if your community is not ready to welcome them back because they don't feel that it's safe or it's time, they're within their full rights to actually do so. And we have had some communities this morning stating exactly that. I hope that answers your question. There has been increasing concerns about travelers from other provinces looking to stay in non-essential stays. We refer our guests to follow provincial recommendations. However, some travelers are still planning on just showing up. Is there any messaging that is being used for this? I think I addressed that in my last answer. You as a hotel will need to determine whether or not you are taking out of province reservations or not. There are many, many businesses that are, and you're within your full right to do so. But following the provincial recommendations and guidelines is very wise. When our occupancies grow, it will be very difficult to maintain the 3-hour limit for room attendants to access the room. Any suggestions as we move forward? Dawn, this is a great question. You know, as a hotel operator myself, the first thing that I think of is your arrival and your departure time. And then the next thing I think about is, are your team, or is your housekeeping department working in teams? Are they working in teams of 2 or 3? Can you be looking at either, and before you even look at that kind of thing, or after you look at that kind of thing, what communication are you giving to your guests so that when they arrive, they understand that their health and safety and your commitment to their health and safety is what makes the difference between when they can get into a room and when they can't. You know, there is some intelligence in the market right now that is suggesting that when people are traveling this year, they will travel for longer periods of time. You know, if your average stay was, you know, 3.7 nights last year, it might be 4.7 nights this year, because people won't be hopping from place to place. They will find somewhere and they will stay there with their group of family or friends. And I do hope, in fact, that's the case, because I know from a fiscal perspective that helps you as a hotelier. We're a bed and breakfast. We plan on herding guests to their rooms. No access to common areas and breakfast in bed. All other protocols followed guests coming into our home. What further steps should be taken as air circulation a concern? Well, you know, the first thing I would do is throw open all the windows, because I think that's probably a good way to circulate air if you're in an area that you can do that. I think your question is about air circulation and the 3-hour recommendation. The 3-hour recommendation is so that the air exchange can occur during that time. So considering the vast number of different HVAC systems out there, some without any, for example, a bed and breakfast or a cottage or an inn may not have a, you know, a big air exchange sort of heat air conditioning system. And so you'll have to look at that time frame and say, you know, is the objective here that the air exchanges and therefore is fresh for the incoming guest? And how best do you do that? And I would suggest doors and windows are a really common sense approach to that. I think guiding your guests to the room is a good idea. I'm not sure about no access to common areas, because there certainly is best practices in cleaning and sterilizing those high touch point areas. And back to Arun's presentation, you know, that hierarchy. Start at the top and ask yourself those questions that are included in the best practice. And there's a lot of detail in the updated best practice document that will take you through that hierarchy. So before you make really, serious decisions about your operation, go through and say, how can we limit this? How can we facilitate that? Could we make a change here? Because at the end of the day, it has to work for your operation, and it has to be workable for your guest, or they're not, you know, you have to look through it that you are an operator and you're hosting people. Should we remove all plates and glasses from suites, even if there is a dishwasher in a suite? Our understanding is no. Within the best practice document, we have a kitchen condo hotel category, and it does address the kitchens and your dishes. There is also within the cleaning section, solutions and very specific cleaners in case you don't have a dishwasher, of how you can make sure that you're practicing the best practices from a cleaning perspective. I think I've already answered this one. It's what is the latest information on time in between guest stays? We have guests staying for a long term, more than a month. Right now, we're doing the room cleaning for them every 2 weeks, when they go back home on weekends or when they go to work. So should we not do it? Okay, we have guests staying for a long term, more than a month. So you have monthly stays. We're doing the room cleaning for them every 2 weeks when they go back home. So I'm reading this that your guest goes home for the weekend and the room is empty for a couple of days. While they're gone, you clean it and then they come back in. And I would suggest that 3-hour increment is completely relevant here. I would wait 3 hours if it was me for the guests to leave. I would go in and I would clean the room, and then they can come back to a nice clean room. If that's not what the question and I'm misunderstanding, please feel free to reach out to the emails that we'll be providing for you at the end of the webinar. Guest breakfast. Any ideas on how to move back to hot breakfast? We're currently bagging breakfast with peelable fruit and wrapped granola bars and yogurt, etc. We actually have embedded the best practices for food and beverage with the Restaurant Association and our partners with BCRFA and Restaurants Canada. You can have hot breakfast, and the guidelines are what that hot breakfast is. Obviously, within the hotels, we have limited service hotels, we have full dining rooms, we have patios, we have lounges, we have tasting bars, we have all kinds of things. And those protocols, it's really important that you understand the food and beverage protocols. Whether you're a food and beverage or a bed and breakfast or a hotel, they are scalable and they definitely apply to you. Okay, I just got my 3-minute warning. I was just getting ramped up here. Almost time, the last question. So I'll just ask, do we have any guidelines on how to handle guests refusing to social distance or to physical distance? Wow, I know those problem guests, you've always got one. You know, I suppose it's like any other bad behavior that you have to deal with. You know, people on pool decks, you know, I thought about this when we were thinking about pool deck physical distancing. Any of you with a pool will remember that one of the worst things is people running out in the morning and throwing their towel on a chair, and now all of a sudden they have 8 chairs and they're not going to share them with anybody else. And, you know, one of your team has to go out there and say, I'm sorry, but you can't do that because that's, you know, selfish, or however you want to voice it. This is kind of the same thing. You know, I think whether or not it's another employee, it's a guest, you know, it's somebody doing something inappropriate, it's very important that you man your team during your training and development on those verbiage that fits your brand and your commitment to health and safety, that they are completely within their right to go and actually correct them and educate them on the importance of physical distancing. And, you know, that is not what, I don't have terminology within the best practice document, but I certainly can imagine as we're developing training programs. And, you know, Krista, I'm thinking about the work that we no doubt will be doing together in the future. You know, as a hotel manager, I always had the list of what you do say and what you don't say. And that is brand true. And it's also provides, it really provides that sort of that foundational piece where an employee of in any department has the right to actually address them. But you as the manager should be coming up with something that actually supports your brand and your tonality. But Krista, let's make a note for that, because I think that could be really helpful work that we could do. Okay, I believe that we are, oh my goodness, we're 2 minutes over time. I would like to, first of all, thank all of you who have joined us for the webinar this afternoon. We never know how relevant it's going to be, how successful it will be. We just believe that if we're getting these kinds of questions, that we really need to provide the opportunity for you to ask them. It also allows us an opportunity to be in front of you so you get to know us a little bit. And I think the partnership between Go2HR and BCHA is a very strong one. And I think all of us will need to work together in the coming months to make sure that we survive this the best possible. Please do reach out to the contact information that is on the screen. Terry, if you just go back one more. And then again, reach out to any of us at any time if you have any questions. We are planning on doing and continuing a series of webinars as information comes forward. Please make sure you sign up for our communications. We send them out very timely, hopefully not as many in the future, but as we feel it's important to you, we'll continue to do that. Thank you very, very much again. And we're here for you. It's a terrible time and we're here for you. We're doing everything we can to make sure that we get through it together. Be well, stay safe. Thank you very much.